Hi everyone, I'm Ben Rhodes. Today I'm going to be talking about whether or not gifted learner programs support or hurt our nation's brightest students. Growing up, I was very lucky in elementary school. My teachers and administrators had identified my needs as a learner, and I was placed in one of these gifted learner programs, a program that continued throughout middle school and throughout high school, and it was very beneficial for me. It helped me explore things that I might not otherwise have been able to in a normal classroom setting. It developed my skills as a learner. Was just all around a very positive experience, informative experience on me growing up. And it wasn't until later in college that I learned that I would have been one of the lucky ones because my school district growing up had the funds, the resources, and the determination to want to help the gifted and high ability learner students. But across the country, there's been a debate for a long time about what to do with other gifted learners, and not everyone had the same support I did. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the debate around what Americans think about, what educators and parents and administrators think about what to do with gifted learners, as the debate has raged since for 50 years now. But in the last 20 years, there's been some pretty important developments. So it's first we should start off with why all this matters. I mean, it's pretty simple. There's millions of kids every year in American schools who are high ability learner kids, and some of them are not being supported to the degree they should. Some aren't being helped, some aren't being pushed enough, challenged enough, supported enough, and this has consequences for their learning. It can stunt their development and hurt them later on in life. So I think this is a critical issue because it affects so many every year. It's well known that America has been falling behind in many world educational standards. In fact, according to Finn and Wright in 2015, quote, among the 34 countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development whose students took the PISA exams in 2012, the United States ranked 17th in reading, 20th in science, and 27th in math. Now, this has been obviously concerning to a number of people. Those kind of numbers, clearly America is lagging behind other countries in the world. And so for many, that concern is that gifted students aren't being pushed to reach their full potential, which is a disservice to those students, but also to, America as a whole and our education system, in general. So, in the 2000s, when President Bush and his administration passed the No Child Left Behind Act, this created, a whole new added fuel to the fire in the debate over gifted children because No Child Left Behind Act has emphasized a minimum benchmark. Without everyone must meet some sort of minimum standard, and there's no such thing as a maximum, which sort of leaves our gifted learners high and dry because there's no incentive for them to be pushed any more than the minimum benchmark, which they achieve rather easily. According to Finn and Wright, quote, U.S. education policy for decades has focused on boosting weak students to minimum proficiency while neglecting the children who have already cleared that bar. So clearly, our gifted students aren't being left behind. They're almost being just left to dangle because they meet that minimum benchmark and they have nowhere else to go, right? So again, quote, this policy makes it impossible for states to truly track academic gains by high achievers. We can track, the lowest achievers and leave none of them behind, but the high achievers, are just sort of high and dry. The Davidson Institute goes further. They say our brightest students are not learning in school. The fact is that No Child Left Behind is promoting underachievement among our nation's brightest students. Right, so our brightest students, they're left, they're supposed to meet this minimum benchmark, and in fact, that's not very hard for them, so that makes them underachieve. Right, so and the debate continues, who decides what's important to know, who decides what that minimum benchmark is, who decides what counts as meaningful and necessary education. Those are tough questions, and then, once that minimum benchmark is established, again, the problems I mentioned above. So the real question, I think, is how can the American educational system appropriately challenge students while also providing enough resources for those who struggle? Because you want to be able to help every child and every student, and you want to be able to have the less gifted or less talented meet that minimum benchmark to make sure they're passing and not being left behind. But you also want to challenge the ones that are in front and push them to be their full potential. So how can the needs of every student be met if we only teach to that lowest common denominator? Right, so obviously, supporters of gifted education see all these problems of not challenging gifted students to their full potential to be a bad thing. Supporters of gifted learner programs push for those programs to ensure that the brightest students, are allowed to maximize their full potential, which I think is, a noble idea. Of course, there has been opposition to gifted learner programs. Many of these claims stem from ideas of elitism or classism. According to Annie Smark, quote, gifted education puts in tension two equally compelling strands of American thought. On the one hand, Americans are egalitarian. We resent unearned privilege, and we intuit that public schools ought to be where very different young people come together to prepare for an equal shot at the American dream. On the other hand, Americans believe in individualism. We appreciate that different people with different aptitudes and ambitions will accomplish different things. We want to cultivate special gifts so each of us can be our very best. Right, so we want, at the one hand, we're rooting for the brightest kids to be the best, but at the same time, we want to give everyone a shot. So we go to that minimum benchmark again because we want everyone to be the same, to have the same shot. But then that goes against us. So we kind of this, contrasting and conflicting two strains of thought in American public discourse. So many have claimed that gifted programs don't give everyone a fair shot, right? Because if you're only teaching the brightest kids the hardest things, then it does leave others behind, right? People claim that these programs are thus elitist. Often the kids in gifted learner programs are upper middle class, non-minority students, and then often these programs are skewed against minorities who don't have the same kind of access or background that the other gifted students do. So even more opposition comes from students who claim that gifted learner programs are essentially like eugenics, where we selectively take the best and brightest and let them continue at a faster pace. I think it's worth noting that other countries, the ones that America is lagging behind in, and those educational standardized testing that I've mentioned, they do have measures in place that best serve their gifted students. There's a couple of them. A lot of them have. Germany, for example, has extra schools that are specifically designed for gifted learners, where you have to test into them or be admitted on the basis of some sort of exam. Some of them have extra tutors for the brightest kids. Some have selective admissions, and the list goes on. But the point is, there's many measures in place in these countries to support the best and brightest, and that is eventually reflects on the standardized international test scores. So to this point, I've sort of focused on the academic debate around these programs, but I think it's definitely worth considering what gifted learners themselves have to say. You've heard my perspective, but there are many others out there, both current and former gifted students in elementary school or middle school programs. It's interesting that many gifted learners later in life report feelings of unhappiness and depression. There's many common claims, but they're varied. A lot of these following quotes are taken from the Reddit page Former Gifted, which is where students who were called gifted in elementary school or middle school are now in their late teens, in their 20s, and their 30s, and they talk about how that affected them. The common claim is that too much pressure placed on them when they were kids burns them out, which turns them off from learning. One user, quote, said, "I have hated myself for every setback in my life and can never dig myself out. I have no idea how to get healthy and motivated and have nothing to show for." Right, so if you push them too hard when they're kids, it'll burn them out. It'll make their work ethic sort of trail off later, ruins their motivation, that kind of thing. But then the other side of the coin is another common complaint is that they weren't challenged enough. And then when they were breezing through everything as a kid to meet that minimum benchmark, it didn't instill the value of hard work because they never had to work for it. And this hurt them severely later. Another user says, after everything was so easy and everyone told them how great they were, when things got harder later, middle school, high school, college, they lost motivation and their grades severely suffered for this. And then this plays into feelings. This plays into issues of mental health because once you've been told you're so great your whole life, and then you get to high school and you're the one lagging behind now. You feel depressed or unfulfilled because you feel you should have accomplished more. Everyone always expected you to do great things, and then you sort of don't live up to those, and that affects you mentally. So these feelings last for years because as an adult you can feel unfulfilled because that former promise you supposedly had as a child and that was bestowed on you has sort of gone unfulfilled. So there's this whole culture of former gifted kids who are now adults, and there are countless memes and stories and social media posts discussing how many of them feel stuck and depressed and unfulfilled 10 years 15 years after they were in a gifted school program. So there's clearly quite a few issues here. I mean, we have, on the one hand, we got parents saying it's elitist. We got other parents saying, well, my kid's smart enough. He should be, he or she should be in a gifted learner program. He's not being challenged properly. We have gifted students themselves saying that, I'm depressed now as a 25-year-old because I feel unfulfilled and unmotivated. So there's got to be some solutions here, right? I think there's quite a few things we can do to remedy all this without, perpetuating myths of elitism or classism. Many scholars have obviously thought about this, and some professional solutions from academics and different scholars is, according to Finn and Wright, they believe that we should conduct universal ability screening. This would be something like they have in Germany, where every kid tries to test into these high ability learner schools. And then, so with this universal ability screening, this would, not at a necessarily young age, but, as you progress throughout school, this would allow schools and administrators and teachers to identify which kids are, do need more challenging, more help, more support, at both high and the low end, right? So it not necessarily means only gifted learner programs, but also those who are maybe falling behind. We can identify their needs too. Another Finn and Wright suggestion is that student progress should be based on mastery. The single best thing our education system can do for high ability students and everybody else is to enable them to move through the curriculum at their own pace. I think this is really important. Not everyone learns the same or at the same rate, the same pace, or is best in the same subjects. Really, the point of these programs is to ensure that each student is maximizing their full potential by learning at their own best pace. And I think that's very true, and it's very beneficial for both the high ability and the lower ability students. One last suggestion from a scholar perspective is that, for their part, the states and school districts need to offer better options for high ability pupils. One possibility would be that schools admit on the basis of academic potential. Right, this would be like testing into, a selective high school or selective, secondary educational school, what have you. But either way, this would be a school specifically focused on this kind of thing. But then the question arises, where do you get the resources for this? Who funds this? Is those taxpayer dollars? Whatever. So even those kind of solutions, they're still is very liable for pushback, I think. So I think, from my own perspective, I've thought about this issue for many years, being a former gifted kid, and I have a couple thoughts of my own on, not necessarily how to fix it, but definitely ways to move in the right direction, I think. Drawing upon my own experiences in these programs and how beneficial it was to me, I think, first of all, it's paramount that we can and should continue these programs. I know the positive impact they can have. I've listed many negative impacts above, but as I can tell you firsthand, that there is a good one can be undeniably beneficial, so beneficial to a learner growing up, especially during those formative years. Learners deserve individual attention, regardless of their level of ability. So clearly, there must be a balance struck between, one, no additional gifted student options at all, and two, simply telling them how great they are without ever instilling a true sense of diligence within them. So I think the key balance here is that they must be challenged, gifted learners, without burning them out, right? And I think that's a difficult balance, because you want to push them and make them better to reach their potential, but you don't want to burn them out as a fifth grader, ruin their love for learning. I think the best way to do this, in my own opinion, is that to have gifted programs that allow the students to work at his or her own pace, but also ensures that pace is requiring them to actually work hard, right? You want them to be able to learn and engage with the material at their own rate, but you also want that rate to be just challenging enough that it keeps them motivated, keeps them going. Through this, I think there would hopefully be two different effects. One would be fostering a love of learning by stimulating a young mind, a developing mind, and two, challenging them enough that they develop those study habits that will be required later. You don't want to make it too easy and have them not know how to work hard, so when college comes they don't know how to study, and you don't want to burn them out. I was lucky because my own sense of determination and hard work, something that I was just instilled with by my parents mostly, and I was always challenging myself to do better because I love to learn. Any gifted program that we put in place, must foster that sort of love for learning and sense of hard work. Teaching that is not easy, but I think if it's done properly, gifted students can reap those benefits for the rest of their lives.